For decades, the United States stood unchallenged at the center of global trade and influence. 20 years ago, it was the top trading partner for nearly every major economy. The dollar reigned supreme, US tech ruled the world, and if Washington didn't like a country, it had the power to isolate it, but that era is over. Today, when the US tries to cut off China, economically, technologically, diplomatically, it's no longer a global campaign. It's a solo mission. And it's failing. Because isolating China in 2025 isn't just difficult, it's impossible. Please take a moment to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Let's start with the obvious. China is the world's manufacturing backbone. It produces over 28% of global manufacturing output, more than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. Every iPhone, every Tesla battery, every sneaker from Nike, all of it relies on Chinese factories, Chinese supply chains, Chinese efficiency. Even when companies talk about diversifying or nearshoring, they're still tangled in Chinese logistics. And the United States knows this. That's why in 2024, Washington imposed massive new tariffs on Chinese goods, some reaching as high as 145%. The goal was to force companies to relocate. But instead, China's exports to Southeast Asia surged, 18% to Vietnam, 20% to Thailand. Businesses didn't stop working with China, they just built new bridges around US trade barriers. You can't isolate the factory of the world. But China isn't just a manufacturer, it's now the center of global trade. Back in 2000, maps showed the United States dominating as the top trading partner for most countries. Fast forward to today, and it's China in that position, leading trade for over 120 countries. This isn't some theoretical trend, it's already reality. The Belt and Road Initiative has built out physical and digital trade networks that stretch across continents. Colombia recently joined the BRI. Brazil secured over $27 billion in Chinese investments. And while the United States shouts about decoupling, China's exports rose 8.1% globally in April 2025. Even as trade with the United States fell by 21%, China compensated, and then some, through deeper ties with Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The world isn't shrinking China, it's recentering around it. This is especially true in the global south, where the US message of isolating China is falling completely flat. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America aren't interested in Cold War narratives. These regions once looked up to the US for development aid, security guarantees, and global leadership. But after decades of debt traps, broken promises, and conditional IMF loans, these countries are waking up. They've seen what US influence really brings: control, dependency, and lectures. What China offers, by contrast, is partnership, tangible, visible, rapid development with no political interference. China builds railroads, not regime change. It builds airports, not airstrikes. And it listens more than it dictates. That's why Colombia, long considered a staunch US ally in Latin America, is now joining the Belt and Road Initiative. That's why Brazil just inked $27 billion worth of deals with Chinese companies. That's why countries across Africa are increasingly choosing Chinese-built ports, dams, and highways over Western aid packages filled with strings. This is not just a trade shift, it's a philosophical shift. The global south is done being a pawn in the West's games. It wants infrastructure connectivity and development, and China delivers. The old system, where the US dictated terms through the IMF, World Bank, or military alliances, is losing relevance fast. Even key US partners like Saudi Arabia and Egypt are now deepening energy and tech partnerships with Beijing. These nations have seen the writing on the wall. China treats them like equals, the US treats them like liabilities. And more importantly, many of these countries now understand the long-term value of Chinese cooperation. The roads, rail lines, power grids, and digital networks China is building aren't just infrastructure, they're lifelines to the future. And once that connectivity is in place, it's permanent. You can't just reverse a port deal or a fiber optic backbone overnight. These projects are deep-rooted economic relationships, and they make the idea of isolating China laughable. There's also a growing realization across the global south that the US isn't as essential as it once was. Financial systems are diversifying, trade flows are shifting, political alliances are more flexible. And with each passing year, America's monopoly on leadership gets weaker. Countries are no longer afraid to say no to Washington. They're no longer terrified of being cut off from American markets or banks, because China, and Asia more broadly, offer an alternative that is just as big and arguably more stable. Even America's closest allies aren't buying into its isolation campaign anymore. Europe is quietly turning its back on Washington's economic bullying, and it's not just about trade, it's about trust. After years of being blindsided by unilateral tariffs, threats, and erratic foreign policy shifts from the US, many European countries now openly question whether America is still a stable and reliable partner. When Trump first launched his tariffs on European steel and aluminum, it shocked the EU. But what followed? Trade wars, threats to NATO funding, abandonment of the Iran nuclear deal, and climate treaty withdrawals solidified something deeper, a lack of confidence. The continent is no longer willing to be economically hostage to American mood swings. Countries like Germany and France are doubling down on ties with China, not just for economic growth, but as a form of strategic autonomy. French President Macron has publicly declared that Europe must avoid becoming America's follower. Germany continues to expand industrial and tech collaboration with China, seeing it as a market that can't be replaced. And now, Sweden has gone a step further, proposing that the European Union join the CPTPP, a Pacific Trade Pact led by Asia. That's not just trade diversification, that's a signal to Washington. Europe wants a seat at the table where Asia and China are calling the shots. The message is clear. Europe no longer trusts the US to lead responsibly. It no longer believes in the old Cold War logic of blind allegiance. And most importantly, it no longer feels like it needs the US to survive. The world has changed, and Europe is adjusting, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. The reality is China offers consistency, infrastructure deals, stable supply chains, and market access. The US offers sanctions, blacklists, and fear. And in this century, fear is losing. Meanwhile, China's tech ecosystem is no longer dependent on the West. Companies like Huawei, BYD, and SMIC are world leaders in 5G, EVs, and semiconductors. When the US banned TikTok and restricted access to advanced chips, China responded by doubling down, creating its own domestic alternatives. It has its own payment systems, its own AI platforms, its own chip design pipelines. The era of technological dominance by the US is facing a formidable challenge from China. But perhaps the most ironic piece of this story? US corporations themselves don't want to leave China. Apple still relies on Chinese factories. Elon Musk can't stop praising China and expanding Tesla's presence there. Tim Cook flew to Beijing and literally thanked Chinese partners for being essential to Apple's future. Over $250 billion in US investments are still tied up in China. So while politicians talk about decoupling, the people who actually run America's biggest companies are doing the opposite, expanding. And it's not just trade or manufacturing. China is expanding its financial reach too. The yuan is now being used to settle oil deals with Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's being added to central bank reserves around the world. China's own alternative to the SWIFT payment system, CIPS, is quietly building an international network for cross-border finance. As Washington weaponizes the dollar, more countries are looking for ways out. And, well, Beijing is offering them an exit ramp. Now let's be clear, the United States has tried to contain China militarily too, with alliances like AUKUS and military exercises in the South China Sea. But this isn't 1945. China is a nuclear power with a massive growing navy and advanced hypersonic weapons. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines may host US bases, but they don't want to be dragged into a shooting war. Trade matters more than tension, and no one wants to be a battlefield between two superpowers. Lastly, we need to talk about the fantasy of sanctioning China. The United States could cut off Russia, because Russia is small. Its economy is the size of Texas. But China is the second largest economy in the world. Its trade is so integrated into every supply chain, every commodity, every sector, that even during Trump's brutal trade war, US imports from China never really stopped. They just got rerouted through Vietnam or repackaged elsewhere. Sanctioning China would wreck the global economy. The world isn't ready, and won't ever be, to make that sacrifice. The bottom line is, the United States can't isolate China because the world has already chosen China as a core partner. The American-led global order is cracking. Not because the United States is weak, but because it's outdated. It plays by yesterday's rules. China, on the other hand, offers the world a new game, one built on infrastructure, trade, and mutual interest. And whether Washington likes it or not, most of the world is playing. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe for more content.